This is a real story that has absolutely traumatized me and my boyfriend. 2 years ago, I moved to the UK for university, as I always wanted to go there and get away from my parents. Back then, the situation at home was beginning to become too toxic for me. In my first year at the university, I moved into a student accommodation and met some really great people. It was a good year, just enjoying my time away from my family and discovering what independence really meant. Anyhow, as the second year came by, I decided with some friends to move into a house rented by student accommodations. We'd have our own house and weren't restricted as much with noise and parties as living in a small shared flat like in our first year. I had a ground floor room, and my window gave into a very small backyard in which I would go smoke every day. There was also a very thin wooden door giving in to the other side of the street, where you would put your bins and broken chairs. That door could only be closed and locked from inside the backyard. Since it was an old door, we had to attach some strings to keep it closed for good. I had neighbours on each side of the house, so we were surrounded by families and some other student accommodations. The neighbours on the right of us were 5 boys. To me, they looked way over the age of being in a university. They were strange, so to say. I met one of them outside of our house one day because of a police intervention. Apparently, one of his flatmates attacked him and the others with a kitchen knife and burned their kitchen down. I heard some screams, so I went outside with my flatmates and saw one of them being covered in blood. The guy had cuts everywhere on his arm and a wound on his head from a kitchen knife. My flatmates and I didn't know what to do at first. We offered him our help to clean himself and gave him an old shirt to change out of his bloody clothes. We then saw the guy who hurt these flatmates being escorted out by the police and into a van and driven off to be arrested. I don't know anything more about the story as the police didn't really tell us anything else. Anyway, the guy who we helped was quite weird. He said a lot of weird things and kept trying to flirt with me. We noticed when helping him he smelled like weed, but we just didn't really care at the moment. We just wanted to make sure he was okay, as we didn't know him. Then, after some time had passed, I would go to my classes and come back home and see him quite often in the street. I just never said a word to him again. But one day, he came up to me in the street while I went to the corner shop. He started talking to me weirdly and tried to get my number, and I didn't feel comfortable at all. Because of that, I chose to just continue with my thing and not respond at all. He then just said that it's okay, and he would just wait in front of my house to talk further. I was creeped out, but I dismissed it as a joke. I bought my drink at the shop and headed back to my street. As I turned into the street where my house was, I saw him with his flatmate sitting on my doorstep and waiting for me. So I panicked and went back to the corner shop and called my only guy flatmate to ask him to open the door and tell the guys to go away. But obviously he wasn't home and no one else was either. So I literally just waited it out until they left 1 hour later. I sprinted back home and locked the front door. Just for additional info, my front door had a glass panel on it where you would be able to kind of make out who was standing in front of it. After this already pretty scary encounter, I just tried to avoid the guy and mostly succeeded for a while. But then one day, as I went smoking in the backyard, I noticed that the wooden door was open. That door was previously always closed, and now the strings that we put there to keep it closed were cut off. For whatever reason, I didn't think anything of it, and just closed the door again and put a new string on it. I thought it was one of my flatmates who took the bins out and just didn't tie them back. The weird neighbours would very often scream and yell and fight in their house. It would wake me and my flatmates up in the middle of the night, but we kind of got used to it after a while. But one evening, my boyfriend slept over like he usually did, and he, who usually never ever wakes up because of a noise, woke up in the middle of the night. He thought he heard a bang and some whispering. I was sound asleep, so he very silently woke me up, and we both just waited in the dark and listened for any other noises. Suddenly, we heard the wooden door just shoot open and some footsteps next to my window. I always had my window open because it would get really warm inside. We both just froze. And then we heard the door leading to the backyard get shaken softly as if they were trying to get inside, and then they stopped. Luckily, we had the curtains closed so they couldn't see us. We were ready to get dressed and get the hell out of the room and lock them in if they came in from the window. Then we just heard my window move and get more open. One of the guys was saying something in a different language that we didn't understand, and we started to hear them trying to get in. My boyfriend and I just shot up out of the bed, took my phone and put clothes on and ran out of the room and out of the house. I then called my flatmates and told them to lock themselves in their rooms. After that, we called the police, who came in less than 5 minutes. Luckily, their headquarters were just a couple of streets down from us. I don't remember anything after the police came. I think we were in shock. They ended up catching one guy. The others fled and were later found a few streets up smoking weed. The police told us they went inside their house and found a lot of meth and other drugs. The guys were also carrying massive kitchen knife with them. I was so confused, as I've never done anything to offend or do anything wrong to my neighbours. So the idea of them breaking in with God knows what intentions with a kitchen knife terrorised me and my boyfriend. The two guys ended up being arrested, and one of them was put in prison for 2 years for carrying a weapon with the intention to harm. I never heard anything else from the police, and I moved back home a few months later. I was so scared, and it tormented me for months on end, not knowing what would have happened if my boyfriend didn't wake up. I'm finding it really tough to get over it. I now very often wake up because of the slightest noise and get horrible nightmares because of it. But at least I'm still with my boyfriend, and we often talk about it, and it helps a lot. I am omitting identifying details for the sake of privacy. Let's take it back to 2007. I was 16 when this began, and about 19 when it finally went to court. I'm from a typical suburban family with parents, 2 siblings, and a pet dog. One random day, a neighbour man has a mild dispute with his neighbour. As a totally warranted response, that neighbour man takes every hose he has and floods their yard. I'll call him Norman from here on. So, naturally, Norman was fined for water waste. My parent worked for the water utility in our town. Because Norman lived a block from us, he decided to drive over to the water district shouting that he was an acquaintance of my parent. My parent came in and told him that even if his kids were the ones wasting water, there would be the same repercussions. They stood by their decision to fine him. Also, my parent was never really friends or had interacted with Norman before. Norman was furious, and he repeated the name of the man working the front desk as well as my parents' name. He said that it's now personal, and then he stormed out. My family members and I began to see Norman at random places constantly. He was there at the grocery store, car wash, and even at our respective jobs. Apparently, when you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and your parents pay for your house, you have all the time to stalk. It went from random sightings while out and about to phone calls. It was the cliché 90s type of crazy phone calls. Someone would be breathing on the other side of the line, and sometimes they'd say that they could see us. At this point, Norman was more of an annoyance than scary. But as I have stated, when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. Norman began parking across from our house, staying from dinner time down to 4 in the morning. He was there, literally just sitting in his car, blasting music and staring at the house. He must have had the determination and bladder of a racehorse, because who else can sit there for 10 hours? His music was trash too. Maybe he was a masochist and into self-harm, seeing how long he could suffer through bad music and a full bladder. I doubt anyone with a semi-rational concept of social interaction could fathom why. This went on from 3 to 4 times a week to a nightly occurrence. Imagine being a 16-year-old female who doesn't even feel comfortable changing in her room. There's this permanent prospect he might see through the blinds somehow. Trying to sleep, knowing he's out there, we were prisoners in our own home. He began to get bolder. Norman drove his car speeding and up onto the sidewalk at my sibling and her partner. They were on the sidewalk out front coming home from a date. They both had to physically jump out of the way to avoid being hit. He made lewd gestures at me when I brought my dog out for a walk and was waiting for my sibling to come out and join us on the walk. It was so bad I ended up crying and going inside. This had been going on for a year at this point. The cops always said the same thing. There's nothing they can do unless there is a threat made against us or someone is harmed. My parent confronted Norman in the street after my incident, to which he called the police. The cops then came asking us why we were harassing and threatening Norman. I will never understand why the system waits until you are a victim rather than preventing someone from being victimized. Almost 2 years passed, and it's Christmas time. My parent had a brain aneurysm. Fortunately, they made it through without any lingering effects, which is extremely rare. I convinced my other parent to finally come home for a bit to shower and eat. They had been living at the hospital with their sick partner for a time. At about 9 in the evening, we get a knock at the door. A random man in ratty clothes holding a Christmas present says he is there to deliver it to us. We ask who sent him, and he says he can't say. We ask who he works for, and he shoves the gift at my parent and leaves. We are obviously uncomfortable to open it. My parent decided they needed to know what it was and opened the present. Inside is a 17-page document of the grounds on why Norman is suing my parent that was currently in the hospital. Even I could tell it was fake, with all the grammatical errors and typos. Norman took the time to sit and type this up himself, thinking it would scare us. The document and fake details he put in did not. The fact this 40-something-year-old man was so fixated on our family that he sat and typed a 17-page fake document did scare us. Things progressed, and Norman began pacing in front of his car and pretending to have phone calls. He would talk out loud about pushing my parent down the stairs or knowing where the kids went to school and worked. He remarked how easy it would be to access us at any time. At the time, I worked a closing shift that let me off at about 1 in the morning. He would be parked next to my car and followed me home. One time, I even tried to take random roads, and he still stayed right behind me. Pulling up to the house with Norman parked across the street and having to get out and run to the door was a nightmare. It was a small neighborhood street with maybe 5 feet between a car parked on one side and one on the other. We were all exhausted, from not only the aneurysm scare, but also living while constantly looking over our shoulders. My parents' friend told her friend, who is a district attorney, about the situation. She called and came over and took our case pro bono. Testifying was a wild ride. We had to put in official statements before being called to the stand. We were not allowed to be in the room when a family member was testifying, nor were we allowed to talk in the halls as we waited for our turn. Imagine reliving more than 2 years of traumatic experiences. We were being cross-examined and made out to be a liar. Then, not being able to have your family comfort or support you afterward was not ideal. There was enough to put him away for 1.5 years. A felony restraining order was granted too. We moved while he was still incarcerated. My sister passed while he was in prison, and he immediately tried to sue her estate when he was released. My sister was 21 at her death. He claimed that her testimony of him running his car at her and her partner was false. He added that this false testimonial was the only reason he was locked up, totally omitting the stalking and harassment charges. He dared to say he's entitled to the money people donated to a GoFundMe for her accident. There's so many more details, but this was already long enough. Norman made us prisoners in our own home for years. Clearly, he's still the same and has not learned a thing from his time in prison. This Fruit Loop of a fool obsessed over our entire family, even after doing time. To Norman, we're just not that into you. Find some actual friends with all your free time. I was maybe 15 or 16 at the time. I had gotten a new neighbor whom I will call Emma. Emma was an older lady, like much of my neighborhood, considering I lived with my grandma. She was very sweet at first, and she also had the cutest dog ever. It was a sweet little 3-legged chihuahua who was friends with my dog, but that's not what you're here for, I'm sure. Once I got into high school, she started to act a bit crazy. At first, it started out kind of tame. I was accused of stealing from her house, and I could understand the accusation, really. I mean, I was the only teenager around, and you don't see many old people breaking into houses. The accusations were very odd, though, because she accused me of stealing dog treats and incense from her. The accusations got more and more absurd as time went on. Last time, I was accused that I broke into her house and rearranged her furniture for a bit. This was the start of things actually getting scary. One day, I was out pulling weeds in the garden. Emma then sees me from her front door and comes out. She starts screaming and cursing at me, threatening to call the cops on me to stop going into her house. I have never once been in there, even before when I was friends with the previous tenants. She then went on to say that if the police wouldn't do anything, she would take care of me herself. At the time, I figured she was just threatening to sue me because I think like a rational person. A week passed without hearing anything from her or the police, like she threatened. One morning, I was going on a drive with my dad and Grandma. I was the first to go inside the car, and I went to the back seat. The windows were tinted enough that you couldn't really make out if anyone was sitting back there or not. Apparently, Emma had seen only my dad and Grandma get in. My neighbor from across the street was a family friend. She called my dad, telling to call the cops on our crazy neighbor because she heard her screaming for me from inside her house. She had walked out to see what was going on, just to see Emma stalking around outside my house with a giant kitchen knife. She had apparently thought I was home alone at the time. She ended up being held for 72 hours under a psych evaluation, but she was deemed fine. Once she came back, I wasn't allowed to be home alone anymore. Not long after, she paid us a visit and decided to be very nice. She apologized profusely to me while my dad was with me. It didn't last long, though. About a month later, the same old accusations started again. This time, I think she learned to not look for me with a knife again. Whenever she got the chance, she would just call me obscene names whenever we were outside at the same time. If I was outside on my own, she would watch me from her windows. She even growled at me a couple times. Eventually, she was taken for another 72-hour psych evaluation for something I wasn't told about. Then, she wasn't allowed to come back to the neighborhood again. We then heard from a friend what they learned from Emma's children. She's bipolar and refused to take her meds. Please drop a like and subscribe to Eerie Echoes for more horror stories. As always, thank you for watching.